What up, stackers? Welcome back to the sandbox. I hope everyone out there in the metaverse, in the investing verse, that you're all out there doing well. If you're stacking assets, I salute you. You know how we do it here. Each week I get a silver state quarter and also a dime, silver dime. This week I got the quarter is 3 nines fine, comes with a little higher price tag. So I didn't pick up the dime this week. This week's quarter is the Tuskegee Airmen. I love silver. I love history. I'm excited to own this coin and add it to the collection. I love the story of the Tuskegee Airmen. It's a story of Black excellence, story of American excellence. For anyone who don't know, the Tuskegee Airmen were fighter pilots in World War II. Their job was to protect the bombers that flew over German territory on their way to Berlin and other places in Germany. And on the coin, it's written, they fought 2 wars. And, they fought a war at home and they fought a war abroad. And, they changed people's perspectives. At the time, it was believed that, Black people couldn't be fighter pilots, and the Tuskegee Airmen, proved those people wrong. And they painted their tail wing red, and, to stand out. And stand out they did. Their combat record stood out. Many became aces. Like I said, their combat record speaks for itself, stood out. And, we learned a good lesson from the war. And one of the lessons, is that to compete on, the global stage takes every American. And also you mix in the wind talkers, the Native American Indians played a big role in World War II. We, early on in the war, we cracked the German code. We knew what they were doing before they did it. We had a huge advantage there. And but they couldn't crack our code because we used Native American Indians on our communications. And people, around the world don't speak that language. Americans speak German, French, everything else, these languages are common, but Native American is a language, that is set apart and difficult to learn. And that gave us a huge advantage in World War II. So, to compete on a world stage, it took all of us working together, as one unified. And going on into the future, that's it's what's going to take also. This quote is from, The Richest Man in Babylon. Our prosperity as a nation depends upon the personal financial prosperity of each of us as individuals. And I firmly believe that, to have a strong nation, the people must be strong. To have a prosperous nation, the people must be prosperous. And, to face the challenges moving forward, we're going to have to, everyone working together. The inspiration for today's ponderings comes from a podcast I watched. It was Cam Newton's podcast. Everyone remember Cam Newton, quarterback of the Carolina Panthers, warrior on the football field, Superman. Cam has a podcast, and his guest was John Hope Bryant. Saw my last video. I was kind of inspired by John Hope Bryant. So I've been listening to more of him. I actually just ordered his book. He's very inspiring. And him and Cam Newton, I'll put a link in the comments below. It's a 3-hour long podcast. They don't really start getting cooking until, middle of the podcast. But there was a lot of useful information I pulled out from it. And John Hope Bryant, is they're having a conversation and they're talking about capitalism, the black community, and how John Hope Bryant wants to, make he's really big on financial literacy, and he wants to get people excited about capitalism, learn how the plumbing works. This is the system that, we're governed by. And so, it's a game that, we're playing. And if we're going to play the game, we might as well know the rules, how it works. And he's trying to get, people, not just black people, but poor people in general, involved in capitalism. So John O'Brien describes capitalism as a gladiator sport. And he also gets into mindset, among many other things. Yeah, I found the podcast to be very powerful. Cam Newton was awesome. Cam Newton let this guy cook, gave him a platform, and just, got out of his way, let the guy cook. Cam Newton's very inspiring as well. He's many athletes, 70% of athletes, 70% of football players, basketball players, lottery, people who hit the lottery, they go broke in the first 5 years. And you can tell that Cam Newton is learning about money. And it's good to see that, he's not going to be part of that 70%. He's building something, using his brand, and learning about money. And, having John Hope Bryant on his show, shows his dedication to learning about money. Someone that could really help take you to the next level. I'm going to give my thoughts on capitalism, but before I do, I just want to throw out this conspiracy theory that I entertain. It goes back to like around 2008. And, at the time, around that time, I remember race relations were doing really well. Everyone seemed to be getting along. You had like Jackie Chan, Chris Tucker with the Rush Hour, like #1 in the box office. I remember the Cosby Show, like dominating. Things were going good. In 2008 hit, and everyone started focusing on the banks. Wall Street. We had the Occupy Wall Street. We had 2008 hit, and people lost their homes, pensions, everything. People were angry. The libertarians, the Republicans, the Democrats. They're all down there together at Occupy Wall Street, putting a magnifying glass, on what was going on down there. People were upset by the golden parachutes where these banks, they were gambling and they made bad decisions and they were rewarded for crashing the economy, with these elaborate bailouts and golden parachutes. And so everyone was angry. They were all focused together. And then all of a sudden, we started seeing a lot of this identity politics, lack of a better word, this wokeism coming in, and race relations haven't been the same since. We've been moving farther apart, in my opinion, and I think a lot of that may have been manufactured. There's a court case with the SPLC, very interesting. But anyway, that's just like a little something I entertain. Conspiracy theory I entertain, that, we put our focus on Wall Street and they began using things in the media and other, avenues to begin to divide us. And that, we're stronger when there's unity and when we're together on one accord. I kind of got that watching Tim Pool. He was like a citizen journalist, and he gained his fame back at Occupy Wall Street. He was just a regular kid, and he began filming Occupy Wall Street, uploading it to the internet. And today he has his own little media empire. It's just one of those things that make you say, And while I'm on conspiracy theories, there was this former KGB agent, Yuri Bezmenov, and he warned America about subversion. And this happened, I think, like 50 years ago, back in the 70s. He defected from Russia, and he taught how, like his job was to, basically mislead a generation of, children with subversion where they grew up. And well, his main point was like a place with like America, you can't defeat it from an attack from the outside. It must crumble from the inside. And his job was subversion, planting seeds. And like I said, this was about 50 years ago, but if you listen to the subversion tactics, it kind of sounds like, the social justice movement that we see today. And he explains how it creates division, things along that nature. So, yeah, he's on YouTube. You can watch, they have like an hour, 2 hour interview with him. Very interesting. Well, enough with the conspiracy theories, the things that make you say, All right, wow, I'm throwing myself out here on this video. Anyway, I kind of have a worldview. This is my, financial view. I believe that inflation is my most, immediate enemy. It's often a hidden enemy. I've just recently identified it. And I see inflation as a hidden tax, a tax on the uneducated. So I really put a lot of time, energy, and focus on, beating inflation, reading books, educating myself, listening to podcasts, learning how to beat inflation. Where does inflation come from? The Federal Reserve. I save my hate for those people. And, Jesus, when did he become angry? The only time he became angry was with the money changers. He started flipping over tables because the money changers were putting an unnecessary burden on the people, and they were manipulating them. In my opinion, my humble opinion, and all I know is I know nothing at all, but my opinion is that the money changers are like the JP Morgans, the Rockefellers, the Federal Reserve bankers, the IMF. And I believe these bankers created a scheme where they could gamble all they want. And if they win, it's private gains. If they lose, it's public losses. And what I mean is, these bankers now are positioned where they can take these huge risks, gamble. The gambles pay off. They take the huge profits and keep them. If the banks get into trouble, like in 2008, they need to be bailed out. Then the public, pays the bill. And, I think it's insidious, but getting back to capitalism, is capitalism perfect? No. Is it, it may be the prettiest girl out of all the ugly girls. The best smelling turd in the turd bowl. So capitalism isn't the best, but the problem with like socialism, communism, eventually you run out of other people's money. The good thing with like capitalism is that the producers, the people who produce, are rewarded. The people, in socialism, communism, the producers, they're punished. And so when you punish the producers, eventually everyone stops producing because, why produce? Why get punished for producing? Why why put in the extra effort, you know? So then eventually, you just go bankrupt. So capitalism's not perfect, but it's lifted a lot of people out of poverty. It has done, amazing things. Look in China. They took their communist system and they put some capitalistic, mechanisms in there, and they allowed their people some freedom to be creative and to build. And China has brought, with those capitalist tendencies, they've pulled out 1 billion people out of poverty. So I think capitalism, is the best of them all because it does reward the producers. So I also believe that, I don't know what we actually have here. What we're under today, we have like crony capitalism mixed in with socialism, so I don't think it's a pure capitalistic system. If it was, the banks would have, failed. We wouldn't have bailed them out. But of all the different systems, I vote for capitalism. And, you know, um, John Hope Bryant says, capitalism is a gladiator sport. And, since I got into finance, I love it. I'm like a fish to water with finance. I love it. It's still where, males can compete, you know, that masculine energy, does well there in the investing world. Arithmetic, math, math is still truth. You could fudge the numbers here and there, but eventually, like Warren Buffett says, the tide goes out and we see who's swimming naked, so math is still a standard. It's still the truth. You can't really overcome it. And John Hope Bryan, he's big on, hey, poor people, get in the game, learn how the plumbing works, learn, how to beat inflation. The way forward is financial literacy. In the podcast, he talks about why he moved to Atlanta. He used the Gretzky quote, skate to where the puck is going, not to where it is. And he saw that in Atlanta, there was a lot of black entrepreneurs and he wanted to be a part of that. He saw it was a growing scene and, real estate was doing well in Atlanta. So, he moved his operation there. And, I fear for the young people today. They're getting so many mixed messages, on the one hand, you have some people being taught, a victim mentality. You have others being taught, eat the rich. A lot of people, young people seem to, hate America, hate capitalism. I think they're being taught, some of the bad things of them, but they're not being shown anything about communism, the evils of communism or socialism, anything like that. But he did mention, if you're looking to, start a business, get a good job or something like that, being willing to move nowadays, that day of just going to work at a factory, the Homer Simpson lifestyle, where you can afford to feed a family, buy a house, get a car, get a boat, have a vacation every year. That's over. It's a new day, but with technology, there's a lot of advantages that we could take advantage of. AI talked a lot about, like AI. But going back to like moving, one of my motivations to build wealth is to be able to move. I fear, that, hey, what if this country turns socialist, right? And, I would probably, I want to be able to move, even out of the country. So I see gaining wealth is gaining my freedom, buying my freedom. So jobs are moving and they're moving, from certain states to other states. We see in New York, the mayor, openly socialist mayor, went after the hedge fund manager, Ken Griffin, on social media. And Ken Griffin, you know, is the, I guess, owner, CEO of Citadel. Citadel's this huge hedge fund, other amongst other things, and they're in New York, and they're they just bought this property, and they're building one of the biggest towers, in New York at the moment. They're getting ready to start the deconstruction and begin on construction, which would bring like 6,000 construction jobs, temporarily, and then bring like 16,000 jobs, for the office building. And now that, they have this mentality, eat the rich, and, they're attacking the rich and they're going after them with taxes, things of that nature. But, he pays billions, Citadel pays billions in taxes. Um, they, their charity, they've given 650 million to the charities in New York. They support, their employees support people who own businesses like food businesses that feed them lunch. So, they do a lot of good in the community, but they're getting ready, seriously considering dumping the project and moving to Miami. You look in Chicago right now, there's a big fight in Chicago. They have a socialist mayor. They have a big fight in Chicago. The Chicago Bears might move out of Chicago, but they have bigger problems than that. Morton Salt, who's been there since the founding, since the 1800s, their identities mixed in with Chicago. They just packed up and moved their operation. Caterpillar moved out of Chicago. Um, Citadel, Ken Griffin, he originally moved out of Chicago, and so all these big corporations are moving and they're taking the tax base with it and also jobs. So if you know where these corporations are moving, most of them are moving to Miami, Texas, a lot to Tennessee, and so if you move to these states, being able to get employment and having opportunities, building a business, you would have a better shot at, going to these states. There's a guy in the property I watch, and, he's a Detroit native, and Detroit is on the move. They've balanced budget, and Detroit's going in the right direction, and property prices are rising there, and opportunity is beginning to sprout. So the lesson is, the rich are without borders, um, and they can move. And when they move, they leave behind huge tax gaps, employment gaps, opportunity gaps. And, you see in Chicago, Walgreens is closing a bunch of stores in Chicago. Walmart closed a lot of stores in Chicago. And Chicago has policies where, stealing's basically legal, and so, you know, these corporations are choosing not to have stores, in a place where stealing is looked upon as legal. So they're moving out and they create, food deserts, medicine deserts, and then the people have to shop at local corner stores, which have higher prices, or they have to travel for the medications. There's less jobs. It just puts a city in a doom loop. JP Morgan now employs more people in Texas than they do in New York. They're starting to call Texas Y'all Street. That's how bad it's getting. As we seen back in 2020, it's important what state you live in. So John Hope Bryant, he has a lot of great ideas. He has an operation called Operation Hope, where he helps people with financial literacy and, showing people opportunities they probably didn't know they had. Like funerals are a big thing for poor people. And, a little nugget he dropped was that, through your company, through most companies, and I looked into my company, if you're a full-time employee, you get like $25,000 towards like a funeral, things of that nature. He also talked about, life insurance policies. If you want to build like generational wealth, how to use a life insurance policy, to accomplish that, pass down generational wealth and opportunity to someone when you pass on. We all pass on. And so he had a lot of great nuggets, but he hammered home, education, get as much education as you can, really, unlearn what you've learned and start over. And also mindset. And he talked about that his wealth is his mindset. Mindset and wealth are the same thing in his opinion. And if you have the right mindset, you can then build wealth. And like he's saying, if you have like a victim mindset, it's a terrible outlook, and it's not going to give you the results you're looking for. But if you have you're a conquering mindset, you're more than a conqueror, you're an overcomer, you overcome obstacles, you have that type of mindset. Some people have the mindset, hate America, eat the rich. Well, when you say you hate America, you're like a farmer who's cursing the sun, the soil, the rain. You're cursing the systems that allow you to produce. If America falls, there's nowhere else. Where else do you go? Right? So mindset is very important. Mindset's going to determine your actions. Your actions are going to determine your outcomes. There's a lot of opportunity out there, and a lot of the times our worldview, our mindset, our ideology, it puts blinders on us, and we miss the opportunities that are here and present. One thing I've been working on is gratitude, having an attitude of gratitude. A lot of us need to have a better, attitude of gratitude and be grateful for what we do have, still have, the freedoms that we have. Just being able to own property is a huge deal. And, to have property rights protected. And, we're giving that away in some places. It's we don't really understand how big of a deal that is. I always say, I wish every American would visit a third world country when they're young, and the reason why is just to be thankful for what we have here. And, instead of being thankful, we're cursing everything. And it just, I don't see a good result forming from, cursing everything around us. It's like a farmer cursing the sun, the soil, the rain, There's a lot of opportunity out there. Technology is bridging that gap, especially for poor people. Poor people now have access and tools to things they didn't have before. And if you pair that with a good mindset, the future looks bright. AI, can't really touch on it here, but there's courses. You spend $1,000, you get certified. You could get a 3-figure job working in AI. Take advantage of learning AI. There's a lot of opportunity for people who can be productive with AI. Things in the world are changing. We're moving from a single polar world to a multipolar world, and that's going to create opportunities for some and pain for others. To compete with the emerging challenges, to compete with China, to compete on the global stage, it's going to take all of us Americans, learning how to be prosperous, to build a prosperous nation, to become producers, builders. This is getting long. I just kind of scratched the surface, but if you still here after this long, I appreciate you allowing me to rant. It's just something I had to get out. I wanted to throw it out there, see if I get any feedback. A big part of my financial transformation has been, really focusing on identity and having the right mindset, focusing on the correct things, spending time on the right things, having the right conversations, the tough conversations with myself, others. I wish the best for all of us, and I hope everyone, got a little something out of this, or, sparked a thought here or there. Well, this is the Philly Stacker. Keep stacking, keep learning.